Hello students, welcome to today's class. In this class, we will be seeing the current status of experimental psychology. And before we go on to see the current status and the current trends in experimental psychology, we will also be seeing how experimental psychology is being widely applied in various kinds of contexts today. Experimental psychology can be defined as an area of a scientific and accurate study and research of various aspects of human and animal behavior. Experimental psychologists work in a wide variety of settings, including academic settings such as colleges, universities, and research centers, government and private businesses, industries, hospitals, and so on. As you know, the application of experimental psychology has become quite broad-based. And before we go on to see the current trends in experimental psychology, we will be having a brief overview of the various areas of application of experimental psychology, at least the main areas where a lot of advancement and a lot of application has been seen. One major area of application in experimental psychology is the educational setting. Now, a number of principles and research inferences from experiments in learning, motivation, and social psychology have been applied to the educational setting. For instance, the kind of conclusions we have drawn from operant conditioning have been useful to teachers in order to reinforce certain good habits in children and to eliminate the negative or maladaptive habits. Similarly, cognitive psychology techniques and the kind of research we have in that field has helped us start Head Start programs or provide enriched environments to children from deprived backgrounds and children from backward social classes. So also a knowledge of social psychology and different aspects of social psychology, say for example group dynamics, has been very useful for managing the classroom. The teacher can now understand how children form cliques or form friendship groups, formal and informal groups, and how the various principles of social psychology can be applied to an educational setting so that children learn to develop positive interpersonal relationships, intermingle with each other, develop positive communication patterns, and become more healthy and more well-adjusted members of the society. Another area of application of experimental psychology is the industry or the organization. The kind of experimental psychology research which has been applied across industries and organizations has taken place both in the field of industrial or organizational psychology as also related fields such as social psychology. For instance, the kind of research we have seen in a number of fields like leadership, like motivation, has helped us identify what are those factors which create good leaders and what are those factors which motivate employees and other functionaries in an organization to move towards their own goals. As also research evidences from both industrial and social psychology help us understand the various communication patterns in an organization, how information moves from one stage to the other, and how various communication patterns influence interpersonal relationships in an organization. Similar are results in terms of decision making as to how people participate in the process of decision making or how decisions are made in the organization and how people can be motivated to a great extent to follow these decisions and to meet deadlines. Another major area of industrial psychology research which has actually had a great impact on how industries function is on the proper selection of employees, on the proper placement and training of employees, and as to how to develop greater sense of cooperation and greater sense of belongingness among the employees so that they are motivated to work in the best possible ways for the benefits of the organization. Now, a major area of research which has had a great impact on industrial psychology is the area of stress. Now, this research may come from researches conducted within the industry or researches conducted by health psychologists, clinical psychologists, and even social psychologists, so as to identify as to what are the factors within an organizational context that lead to a lot of stress and how can this stress be handled or reduced, how can we teach people to cope with stress better, and how can we reduce the total amount of organizational stress and involve in a betterment of the organizational climate so that the organization becomes a better place to work in and also employees work better for the benefit of. Although initially experimental psychology and the kind of experimentations and processes that it followed didn't have that great an impact in the field of clinical psychology, yet with the passage of time, the application of research principles and research inferences from the field of experimental psychology also happened in the field of abnormal psychology or psychopathology. There were a number of researchers who promoted the application of these experimental principles and research results into psychopathology. These include Dollard and Miller, these include Sears, Eysenck, Skinner, Pavlov and others, and their experiments which found some kind of therapeutic interpretation within the clinical setting. Say for example, based on the classical conditioning principles is the therapy of systematic desensitization. In systematic desensitization, as we know, a person who is suffering from some kind of phobia towards a particular object is given a graded exposure to that object so that slowly he overcomes that fear or phobia. Similarly, if we use Skinner's instrumental conditioning principles, we will find how reinforcement influences behavior modification. Mental patients and patients suffering from mental disorders or mental retardation, for instance, are trained to fulfill at least their basic requirements and engage in basic hygiene tasks and other duties through a process of behavior modification and reinforcement, where for every positive behavior they show, they receive some form of reinforcement and slowly they learn different forms of behavior. Another important contribution to the field of clinical psychology and psychopathology was Selley's experiments on stress. As we know, stress can even be called the single biggest factor in psychopathology. And Selley, in his course of experiments, showed as to how stress affects the body and what are the processes involved in the stress experience and what kind of physiological and psychological changes are involved. This gave a great deal of insight into how the stress experience can be controlled and how maladaptive behavior and psychopathology which emanated from stress could also be controlled. Also, as we know, in its initial days, experimental psychology usually conducted experiments with animals as their subjects. However, in recent times, the scope of experimental psychology has broadened widely to include even human subjects and conduct a host of experiments related to human subjects. These are sometimes called the new look experiments, which try to understand a number of higher cognitive processes such as thinking, memory, motivation, and other cognitive processes in the human being. Some of these pioneering psychologists include experimenters like Kohler or Brunner or Lewin et al., who conducted a host of experiments on human subjects on various aspects of human cognition and feeling. Another new area of experimental psychology research is its research in the area of parapsychology. As we know, initially psychology began as a science of the mind and then as a science of consciousness and so on. Even the first experimental psychology laboratory put forward by Wilhelm Wundt in 1879 at Leipzig in Germany tried to understand the individual's conscious processes, and for this he recommended the process of introspection or looking within. Even his students such as Edward Bradford Titchener followed the same process of introspecting into your conscious experiences so as to know the workings of your own mind. However, as time progressed, we know the behaviorists and empiricists emerged who put forward that consciousness was not a subject of empirical study, because if you ask what is consciousness, you cannot describe it, you cannot see it. Whereas behavior is something which is observable, which can be seen, and hence it can form a subject of experimental study. Now, experimental psychology in recent times has become so broad-based and so advanced that we can study those processes which were seen by the behaviorists as unobservable and unresearchable, that is, the processes of consciousness. Today we can study using highly scientific, accurate and experimental methods. For instance, we know that now a number of experiments are being conducted on altered states of consciousness. They are being conducted on sleep. They are also being conducted on dreams. Even psychologists have been capable of inducing dreams in people and seeing their effects and the processes involved. Another major contribution of experimental psychology, which is seen as innovative because this is an area we would never have expected an experimental or scientific or accurate procedure to come into, its contribution to the field of parapsychology. Parapsychology, as we know, is a field which studies consciousness and other related processes which cannot be explained in terms of any kind of physical phenomena or physical perceptual experience. There are a host of topics which parapsychologists study, say for example precognition or clairvoyance or psychokinesis or telepathy or reincarnation or near-death experiences, apparitions and so on. So as we know, none of these are easily observable and nor can we find easy cause and effect relationships. Yet, the progress in experimental psychology is documented by the fact that it has gone on to use scientific and accurate methods even in such fields which are so far away from our physical realities. Now that we have seen how experimental psychology has been broadly applied to a number of different fields, we will come to understanding certain current trends or current status in the field of experimental psychology. Now, the current trends in the field of experimental psychology are of course influenced by the current trends in social phenomena and the current changes in social phenomena, because psychology studies the human being as an essential member of the society. As we know, in recent times, we as a human race are experiencing change like never before. All aspects of our human life, including our values, our attitudes, our beliefs, our family systems, our educational experiences, our occupational experiences, even our social relationships and experiences are under a process of change. And this change is at times so fast that it becomes difficult to keep pace with it and to move along with it. And hence, experimental psychology deals with three processes involved in dealing with this rapid change in the human environment. The first is the process of information processing. Psychologists seek to know as to how individuals process this kind of rapidly changing information that they get from their environments. Information processing may involve the process of the acquisition of information, the maintenance or retention of certain kind of information, the modification of information, the relearning of information, and even the recollection of information. Now, these are a number of complex cognitive processes and determine as to what an individual attends to in the environment, or what are the factors in the environment that influence him the most, or how does he process the information that he receives from the environment, whether he processes it positively or whether he processes it in negative or maladaptive ways, and how can this form of information processing that an individual engages in either contribute to his well-being or contribute to dysfunction. A second area of change and of research in experimental psychology naturally is stress, because any form of change, whether good and bad, leads to some amount of stress. Of course, a negative change will lead to a greater amount of stress, but we cannot deny that even change in any form involves a certain amount of stress. And hence, a major area of research for experimental psychologists is how do people experience stress and how do people deal with it. They seek to understand patterns of the stress experience as to what kind of people are more prone to stressful experiences, how people's interpretation of their environments lead to stress, and what is the experience of stress, and how can stress be dealt with, how can stress be coped. For instance, if you take the example of Suzanne Kobasa's research on hardy personality, we can see that she put forward on the basis of research that there are certain individuals who have a certain personality type which can be called a hardy personality, that is, they are better suited to cope with stress. Now, such a research in experimental psychology immediately raises possibilities for therapeutic application, we can see what are the characteristics that a person having such a hardy personality or a person having such a personality-based buffer to stress has. And when we see these characteristics, we can seek to apply this to real life, try to develop those characteristics in ourselves and those around us so that we can cope with stress better. A third area related to both stress and related to both change, which experimental psychologists deal with, is the process of readjustment, because change involves readjustment to the new circumstances that are put forward. And readjustment is a process which involves a lot of emotional as well as physiological challenges and stress, and hence a basic process that experimental psychologists deal with is how individuals readjust and adjust to their environment. Now, what we will be doing in this chapter at this stage is to overview very briefly 4 major current trends in experimental psychology today. The first trend is less dependence on sophisticated gadgets. In earlier times, experimental psychologists depended to a large extent on a number of instruments and gadgets to measure various processes of human cognition and feeling. And in fact, towards the Middle Ages of modern experimental psychology, the use of gadgets and instruments was so much that in fact it stood in the danger of ignoring the entire complexity of human behavior. The entire concentration was on how better the instruments are or how sophisticated the instruments used. However, in recent times, experimental psychologists have realized that objectivity and accuracy does not always depend only on the use of instruments. And just because we want to use instruments, we cannot ignore the complexity and the dynamism of human behavior. And thus, they have concluded that objectivity and accuracy in experiment is not because of the use of sophisticated instruments, but rather it is based on the attitude of the researcher. It is based on the desire of the researcher to create an objective and accurate experimental design as possible and to get as accurate results as possible. And even controlling different human variables and observing them can be as objective as the use of instruments. And hence, a current trend in experimental psychology is to do away with all unnecessary apparatuses and instruments. A second trend of experimental psychology that coincides with this moving away from the apparatuses is also a moving from laboratory experiments to field experiments. Initially, most of the experiments in psychology used to be conducted in a very controlled and even unnatural condition of the laboratory. However, today experimental psychologists have realized that experiments conducted in such unnatural conditions cannot be applied to real life situations, and hence the results that we obtain from laboratory experiments may not be capable of generalization. Hence, now psychologists are moving towards field experiments. Field experiments try to employ as natural settings as possible. They try to study people in natural settings and in natural atmospheres rather than a mechanistic laboratory setting. And also they try to exercise as much control as possible over the different variables. As much control that the situation, that is, as much control as the natural situation allows them to exercise. And they have also realized that the objectivity or validity of an experiment depends upon the extent to which the results of the experiment coincide with normal human behavior. And if the results of the experiment show what human behavior is in normal situations, and if the results obtained in a field experiment can be replicated and applied to a normal population and its behavior, then field experiments are as valid and as reliable as laboratory experiments. Another recent trend, or another trend which reflects the current status of experimental psychology, is a reliance on human subjects and a movement away from animal subjects. As we can see, a large amount of earlier experimental psychology research had animals as their subjects, and most of the experiments were conducted on animals. Of course, the moving away from animal subjects towards human subjects is not to negate the importance of the research conducted on animal subjects. We accept that there are certain forms of researches which cannot be ethically or practically conducted on human beings. Yet, researches conducted on animals can only reveal rudimentary aspects of the individual's psychological processes. This is because the human being is a far developed and advanced animal as compared to other lower level animals, and hence he or she has higher level cognitive processes such as thinking, memory, attention, reasoning, problem solving, decision making, and a host of other higher cognitive processes which cannot be studied in animals because animals do not possess these kind of abilities. Hence, experimental psychologists have realized that any kind of fruitful research on these aspects of human abilities and personality will essentially require the employment of human subjects, and we cannot actually generalize or replicate results of animal subjects to human subjects. And so they have designed innovative means and ways to use humans as subjects in their experiments. Now, the last trend that we discuss here, which reflects the current status of experimental psychology, is the movement from inductive reasoning to deductive reasoning. What is inductive reasoning? In inductive reasoning, we have a great amount of knowledge on the basis of which we come to a single conclusion. On the other hand, in deductive reasoning, we have a conclusion, and on the basis of that conclusion or theory, we deduce or we apply information to a large class or category. Now, in the earlier times, what experimental psychologists used to do was to collect a lot of information from observation, from other forms of experimentation and so on. And on the basis of all the research and the data that they had collected, they would formulate generalizations. And on the basis of those generalizations, they would put forward theories. For instance, if you see the classical conditioning theory of Ivan Pavlov, it all began with the dog salivating to the bell in addition to salivating to the food. And hence, based on the behavior of the dog, Pavlov collected a lot of information. And based on that information, he formulated a theory of classical conditioning. But in recent times, experimental psychologists are engaging in deductive reasoning. That is, they have a theory in place before they actually begin their research. And they belong to different theoretical orientations. On the basis of their own theoretical orientations, they put forward a proposal of the relationship between different human variables or different human attributes. And this hypothesis or proposed relation, they test in an experiment, either proving it to be wrong or proving it to be right. Thus, the process is not from observation, experimentation and theory, but the process is from theory to hypothesis to experimentation and then to a conclusion. And this is one important development in experimental psychology, because this has created groups among experimental psychologists, and all psychologists belonging to one group of thought, say behaviorism or say psychodynamic theories. They put forward their own methods of experimentation, they put forward their own theories and hypotheses and try to use their viewpoints to understand human behavior through their means of research. Thus, we can see that today in this chapter we have seen how experimental psychology became broad-based and expanded its scope of activities to a number of fields such as education, such as clinical psychology, or even parapsychology for that matter. And then we have also seen how currently experimental psychology focuses on three aspects of human behavior, that is information processing, stress and readjustment, because these are the most valid topics considering the kind of changing environment we live in. Finally, we had a brief look at 4 trends in experimentation, the current trends. First, a lesser dependence on sophisticated gadgets and instruments. Second, a movement from laboratory experiments to field experiments. Then a movement from animal subjects to human subjects. And finally, a movement from inductive reasoning to deductive reasoning. And thus we can see that experimental psychology currently, through a number of progressive measures, has come to be not only an empirical science but also a scientific social science.